In the last couple of sections, we went through the setup process on Kubernetes on Mac OS and Windows. To make sure that everything is working as we expect now, I'm going to open up my terminal and run minikube status. When I do so, I should see minikube running, cluster running, and kubectl correctly configured. I'm also going to run the command kubectl cluster-info, like so. And I should see a message like this right here appear. If you see any warning or any error message, it means that something went wrong during the setup process. And you will want to flip over to the QA section on this video and go through a little bit of troubleshooting steps to get everything fixed up. Okay, so now that everything is up and running, we're going to set ourselves a little short-term goal. So we're going to say that as a short-term goal, we want to take the multi-client image that we had put together over the last couple of sections and get it up and running on our Kubernetes cluster that is now locally created on your machine by Minikube, running as a container. So that's the goal. Now, to just say this as a goal without giving any kind of directions or path to get to it is kind of hard. So I'm going to show you a sequence of diagrams that are going to give you a good idea of how to transfer some of your existing knowledge in the area of Docker Compose over to all this Kubernetes stuff. All right, so here we go. We've put together several Docker Compose files throughout this course. And when we were working on the multi-container project, we ended up with a Docker file that had a couple of different services inside of it. Now there's a couple of observations I want to make about the Docker Compose files that we've created throughout this course. The first observation I want to make is that in these Docker Compose files, every entry, or in other words, each of these different services that we created, can optionally use Docker Compose to build the image. And we did that with Nginx, with Worker, and the client. Remember, we specified the build section that provided the path to a context and a Docker file as well. The next observation I have is that each of the entries inside of here represents specifically a container we wanted to create. We were only creating containers through Docker Compose. We did not create any other type of software or program or anything like that. It was specifically containers that were being created inside of our Docker Compose file. Now that might sound like a weird thing to observe, but let's just hold on for that for right now. Now, the last observation I have is that every entry inside the Docker Compose file also optionally defined some networking requirements. In other words, it set up all that port mapping, right? It set up a outside port on our local machine to a port inside one of our containers, as was the case for, say, the Nginx image. Okay, so we got these three observations right here. Now I want to take these observations and kind of map their equivalents into the Kubernetes world. And so this is going to allow you to translate some of your existing Docker Compose knowledge into the Kubernetes world. Okay, here we go. So first off, each entry that we put inside of that Docker Compose file optionally allowed us to build an image. So in the Kubernetes world, we don't get any benefit like that. With Kubernetes, we are expected to come with all of our images already built. So Kubernetes has no build pipeline. There is no build process. If you're going to make use of Kubernetes, the expectation is that during some outside step, you're going to build all of your different images and have them ready to go, ready for deployment onto your Kubernetes cluster. Now, the next big observation was that each entry inside of our Docker Compose file represented a container that we wanted to create. With Kubernetes, things are just a little bit different. With Kubernetes, we do not have a single config file. Instead, we're going to end up with multiple configuration files. Each of these different configuration files that we're going to put together are going to attempt to create a different object. An object is not necessarily going to be a container. Now, you might be wondering, well, what would we ever create when we're talking about these container things than a container? Well, we'll take a look at what it means to create an object in just a second. But for right now, just understand that we use multiple configuration files to create different objects that are going to be in use inside of our Kubernetes application. And the final thing I want to mention, so we had said that each entry inside of the Docker Compose file defined the different networking requirements. So in the Kubernetes world, we have to manually set up a vast majority of all of our networking. So remember, in Docker Compose, if we created all of these different containers inside of a single Docker Compose file, we could very easily connect to other containers. In addition, if we wanted to do any port mapping, it was as easy as adding in a little entry to the Docker Compose file. So in the Kubernetes world, the process of kind of joining together two containers with networking or exposing a port on a container to the outside world is a far more involved process. And a vast majority of the work that we do throughout the rest of this course is going to be all focused 100% on some of these networking topics. That's going to be one of the biggest things that we discuss. Okay, so with all these kind of mappings over in mind, I now want to think about how we're going to essentially treat each of these items as we think about our current goal of getting the multi-client image working on Kubernetes. All right, so I put a final column into this diagram, and these are going to be the steps that you and I are going to go through to make sure that we are able to get our simple container up and running. So when we think about Kubernetes expecting all images to already be built, that means that you and I are going to have to make sure that our image, specifically the multi-client image, is already built and pushed up to Docker Hub. So we're just going to confirm that that is the case. And you'll recall that through the last application that we worked on, we spent a tremendous amount of time making sure that our images were being pushed up to Docker Hub. So our images should already be there. We're just going to make sure that that is the case. Next up, with Kubernetes, we make one config file per object we want to create. So that means that we're definitely going to make one config file to create our container. Now we're going to go into great detail on this right here because technically we're not going to be making our container per se. We're going to be making something else slightly different. But again, we'll go into that in great detail. Now finally with Kubernetes, we have to set up all that networking manually. So you and I are going to make an additional configuration file to set up some networking between our container and essentially the outside world. Or in other words, remember, with our multi-client image, we were starting up an Nginx server and serving up some production React files. And so if we want to be able to access that container from within our web browser, we're going to have to do a little bit of networking setup with Kubernetes. So in total, we need to make sure our image is on Docker Hub. We need to make one config file to create our container, or something that's going to essentially represent or contain the container. Again, we'll talk about that in great detail. And then we'll make a second config file to set up some networking and make sure that our container created during this step is accessible from our web browser. So quick pause. We're going to come back to the next section and we'll get started on step number 1. So I'll see you in just a minute.